He wasn't a hero. He was a man who couldn't walk away. Rain made the diner's neon blur into smeared reds and blues. Steam rose from a pot behind the counter. The scent of fried onions and coffee sat heavy in the air. Jack Rowan moved by muscle memory, flipping patties, sliding a plate across to a regular without looking up. His hands were quick, practiced, capable. His jacket lay folded by the register. Worn denim, the letters LR stitched into the breast in a child's uneven hand. Lila Rose had insisted on embroidering it. Lila sat at the corner booth with a paper rabbit and a crayon smudge on her cheek. She was 8 and serious about ice cream, about bedtime stories, about counting the coins into their little ceramic bank. A list of bills clung like a second shadow on the counter beside Jack. Rent due in 2 weeks, electricity notice, a school trip Lila would remind him about every morning. He kept the notices tucked between the order pad and a jar of toothpicks, their quiet proof of how tight things were. The bell over the door chimed. The rain came with it. 4 men entered, loud and certain, the kind of men who wore names on their cufflinks and thought the city belonged to them. One of them leaned on the counter, smirking at Lila's rabbit. Another pressed his hand into the pocket of his suit, a motion like a threat that didn't need a target yet. The jukebox fiddled with a half-finished song. The diner held its breath. They saw the woman before Jack did. She had slipped into the booth with a wet coat and a handbag hugged to her ribs. Her hair was rain-slicked, and there was a look in her eyes like exhaustion that had nothing to do with the hour. She answered the men's stupid questions politely, until their words sharpened into hunger. They laughed too loud. One of them, closest to the aisle, reached across her table and tried to slide the handbag toward him. She pulled it back. He laughed. Someone else added a shove. The last thing the diner needed was trouble, and Jack had learned, in the slow, stubborn way of people supporting a child alone, that trouble could be ruin. He stepped out from behind the grill. It was not cinematic. It was a shove, a steady hand on a shoulder, a firm voice saying, "That's enough." There was a little scuffle. One of them pushed back. Jack's feet, set years ago on a firing range and then on kitchen tiles, found the small, necessary leverage. The shove turned into a hold, into moving the men apart. No one drew a blade. No one meant to. It was over in less than a minute, the men scoffing as they were escorted to the door. They left with the echo of bad jokes and the taste of being stopped. The woman sat very still. Her hands trembled. Jack reached into a crate of employee jackets and, because his daughter's name had been stitched there and because it felt right, draped it over the woman's shoulders. The letters LR rode the curve of the lapel, bright and small against wet denim. "You're safe now," he said, though he had no right to guarantee anything beyond the small flame of safety inside the diner. The woman looked at the initials and, for the first time, let herself breathe. She thanked him, and her voice had a tremor like relief. Jack thought, for a private second, of Lila and her crooked embroidery, and felt the world narrow to that particular, fragile brightness. He would pay for that choice, he just didn't know how yet. Outside, the rain kept time. Inside, life folded into its usual pattern. Orders called, plates cleared, the neon hummed. But the next morning, a paper envelope sat on the counter where the register's drawer should be. Murphy, the owner, pinched the bridge of his nose before he handed it across. "I'm sorry, Jack," Murphy said. He had the kind of face that had measured too many bad winters. "We got a call. Asks for who runs the night shift. Corporate lawyers. Doesn't matter what they said. They said they'd make it trouble." He kept his voice small. 2 weeks. It's all I can." Jack felt something cold move through him, the way cold moved when you realized the bottom you were standing on had been shifted. He took the envelope and saw the thin neatness of a severance check that would not cover rent and had the exact weight of things ending. Lila came out from the kitchen with her rabbit, eyes wide. She pressed her small hand into his. "It's okay," he told her. He said it because he had to, because she needed a pattern that meant a roof, a future. Inside, he cataloged the failing possibilities. Less food, debt callers, a missed field trip. He wrote a resume, folded it into an email, started making a list of people who might need a decent cook. He checked his savings once, twice, then stopped so he wouldn't have to look at the number. Meanwhile, in a glassed corner above the city's noise, Elena Voss stared at a photograph on her phone. Her assistant had sent it, a grainy snapshot from the night before, someone's cell phone taken in a hurry. In the picture, under neon and rain, a pair of hands laid a small jacket over a woman's shoulders. The initials were visible, LR. It ached something in her chest she didn't expect. The jacket, the anonymity of the man who did what women in boardrooms learned to have men do for them, found her in an odd way. Elena had platforms and briefings and people who protected her. She also had a pregnancy she hadn't planned to announce. The sonogram the doctor had left her with sat face down on the corner of her desk like a secret. In a world that watched whose voice had weight, she felt suddenly exposed enough to be fearful in a way that made her precise, controlled hands tremble. She asked her assistant to run the photo through contacts, through camera feeds that would locate the diner, through anyone who could tell her the name behind the jacket. She did not want pity. She wanted to say thank you to the man who had made a choice that had preserved more than an evening. She wanted to know the face behind the hands that had wrapped her in something that smelled faintly of home. Jack's phone rang 3 days later. It was an unknown number. He let it drain twice and then answered, because Lila needed a new pencil and the grocery line had a few items left unpaid, and because the way a call came could be an answer to the sleepless list. A voice on the other end asked for directions, stuttering around some other urgency. Then the limo arrived. It was absurd in its timing. A sleek black car cut through the rain and pulled up to the modest porch where Jack was letting Lila jump in puddles to keep her from thinking about the bills. The driver made no sudden movement. The door opened like a release valve and out stepped Elena Voss, precise coat, hair tucked at the nape of her neck, the kind of shoes you could not wear for very long without them teaching you how to stand differently. She carried the air of places where decisions were made and consequences weighed with the same hand. Lila froze in the rain. She stared at the stranger the way children do at people who carry stories in their faces. Jack smelled expensive cologne, the citrus of something he could not afford, and remembered how small his life must look from that car window. Elena walked up the steps as though the porch had always been part of her map. She held up a neat white envelope. "Mr. Rowan," she said, and the sound of her name in the little kitchen made Jack's shoulders shorter. He instinctively introduced himself as Jack. She began, and then she took the jacket out of the envelope. It was folded precisely, smelling faintly of detergent and hope. She placed it gently back into his hands. "I wanted to find you myself." Her voice had edges that had known how to command a room. Now it softened. "The night in the diner, I was targeted. Those men work for a firm that does intimidation. They weren't drunk, they were paid." Jack's grip tightened around the denim in a way that didn't mean anything heroic. He had intervened because a woman was being cornered, period. He didn't imagine the men were anything more than bullies. The idea that they were hired, that they were people who used their power to silence another, made something cold run through his chest. "And you're pregnant," he said before he could stop himself, because there was an intimacy to news like that, and because he had seen the tremor in her hands. She nodded. She produced a small printout of a sonogram she had tucked into the inside of her coat like contraband. The image was grainy, a white blur that to one eye might be only shape and to another might be a life. She handed it to him like a trust. He held it cool and small. For a second, it made all the abstractions, power, intimidation, consequence, into one body. "I think you saved us both. I don't want to repay you in a way that feels like charity. I want to give you an opportunity." She explained without ceremony. Her company ran an executive dining room in their headquarters, a place with a staff, a kitchen that fed guests and clients, and had standards he knew by instinct. She wanted him to be head chef. It would mean decent pay, A regular schedule, health benefits that would let Lila sleep in a bed without the hum of worry. It would also pull him into public light. Elena's circles were bright and difficult to escape. Pride tightened around Jack like an old coat. He had been a Marine, yes. He had left service with no appetite for favors. He was a father who battened down dignity because he feared his daughter seeing him as someone who took charity at the risk of his own self-worth. The offer felt like a trade, gratitude for surrender. "I can't," he started. "You can," she interrupted gently, "or you can keep scraping and teaching your daughter what it's like to survive on the smallest of terms. The question is which lesson you want to teach." Her eyes, sharp and not unkind, met his. "And I won't let this be anonymous. If what happened to me was intimidation, it should be exposed. I will say your name." That last part made him flinch. He had not wanted anything from the spotlight. He had not wanted the kind of attention that came with being named by a woman with a platform. Not because he feared the praise, because he feared the ways men in suits could twist stories for leverage. He didn't want his modest life parceled out as moral fodder for someone else's narrative. Lila stepped forward then, small and blunt with the honesty of children. "Will my rabbit have a new kitchen?" she asked, as if careers were appliances. The question cut the tension with a laugh that felt necessary. Jack couldn't help the shape his face made. He took in the sonogram again, felt the line of his daughter's hand in his, the smallness of her trust. "On one condition," he said finally. "I work my way in. I don't want to be a charity case. I want to cook." Elena smiled in a way that was both corporate and human. They stood in the rain, three people with different weather inside them, and made a bargain not of money, but of dignity. She would put him on as head chef. He would come with his pride intact. She would credit him publicly, but she wanted him to be comfortable with however visible that would make them both. He slept poorly the first night after the limo left. He thought about the envelope Murphy had handed him, and about the color of Lila's hair when it caught light. He thought about the sound of the rain on the diner roof. He thought about telling his daughter they might not have to count pennies for soup anymore. And he felt a cracked thing inside him want to put that hope away like something fragile. But the next morning, he called Elena's assistant, who gave him a start date. His acceptance came with its own cost. 2 days after the announcement on the company's site, Elena's public thanks to the brave man who would not let intimidation stand, the phone calls started. Articles with headlines that did not use his name, but used enough description that people he knew nodded when they saw it. Comments online that praised or suspected. A journalist who wanted a profile. The firm the men had come from, Kendall, Avery & Cole, put out a statement that was 2 sentences and non-committal. Elena posted the photograph of the jacket and the sonogram in a measured caption that asked for no applause but insisted on truth. Within a week, HR at Kendall, Avery & Cole announced internal reviews. The press reported suspensions. Names of the men who had come into the diner surfaced, 4 associates who had been working under retainer. The response was the kind of institutional recoil that had a face and a payroll. It was not instant justice. It was not a courtroom. It was suspension and investigation and the very plausible administrative processes that make headlines and, crucially, make consequences. Jack watched it all with a strange disconnection. He had been here before in different forms. The discipline of a unit, the bureaucracy of a chain of command. Now the chain was flipped. There were press releases instead of orders. People in his neighborhood saw him in the paper and clapped in the grocery aisle. Kids in school recognized Lila as the girl from the story. He felt both exposed and oddly relieved. But mostly, he felt an obligation to be steady for Lila, to translate public attention into plates of food that meant warmth, not spectacle. There was inevitably friction. Old men who thought favors should be repaid in cash called his phone and offered ways to handle the people who had humiliated him. A black SUV pulled up outside his apartment one night, headlights cutting across his curtains. 2 men in plain coats asked him for a word that felt like a threat wrapped as a question. Jack kept his tone small and steady. He did not welcome fights. He would defend himself if it came to that, the watchdog in him sharpened by years of service. But the street was lit, A neighbor was awake, and no violent scenes unfolded. Only a warning passed through infernal means, which was enough to leave a bruise on the week's calm. Elena used what she had. She began posting measured updates about the investigation and described the night at the diner as a turning point in how powerful institutions sometimes used brute tactics to silence people who posed challenges. Her voice was factual and unadorned. She did not seek to make Jack into a symbol. She introduced him to a small handful of people who could help build a program that would mean stability for more than one family. The press cycle did what press does. It drifted, returned, swelled. A local columnist wrote about the man in the LR jacket, and someone started a small crowdfunding page to cover Jack's back rent when a piece in a daily paper ran an unvarnished profile of his life: son of a factory worker, Marine veteran, single father, line cook. The donations were modest but honest and came with notes. "Thank you for standing up. My family needs this more than I expected." They did not change his parenting overnight, but they placed small cushions under his shoulders. Jack arrived at the new kitchen with gumption and grease-stiff hands. It was not a show kitchen, it was an executive dining room that fed people who signed expense reports. The knives were sharper, the standards higher. He found himself in the early morning before most of the staff arrived, breathing in the steam of a different kind of shift. Elena walked through sometimes, her coat a line of authority. She had insisted that he run the kitchen his way, that he be given the team he wanted, that the menu reflect his voice. He learned an awkward truth. People who were used to being fed by others were not the same as those who fed the world. He had to call out mistakes without scolding, to shape a crew that had been coddled by corporate freebies into cooks who could carry pride. He did it with the same cadence he'd used at the diner: short sentences, straightforward expectations. Lila came in sometimes on weekends, helping with plating desserts that she insisted needed more sprinkles. The jacket hung on a peg in the workers' room, its LR facing out like a flag. Public recognition came in small waves. Elena made a statement, measured, unequivocal, thanking Jack by name for intervening that night and calling for accountability. She attached a photograph of the jacket and a polite, terse explanation of the events. She promised cooperation with investigators. People applauded. Some called it a PR move. Some called it overdue. For Jack, it meant the men who had pushed and laughed and thought they could buy silence were now facing, in the vernacular of institutions, consequences: suspension, investigation, possibly dismissal. There were no harangues of triumphant revenge. There were reassigned offices, HR interviews, and an internal audit that, in due course, led to several people at Kendall, Avery & Cole being placed on leave while the evidence was examined. A partner at the firm resigned quietly. The press reported that the firm would be conducting a comprehensive review of retention practices. It was language that meant something and nothing. It was also enough to open doors for others who had been intimidated, who had stories that needed telling. Elena's willingness to speak and to put a name and a face to what had happened to her gave them courage. Jack rarely read the comments beneath the articles. He preferred the steady rhythm of his new kitchen and the way a roast came out even, how a sauce thickened under his hand. People brought him their thanks in person. Veterans who came through the dining room because of a new program Elena had quietly begun to fund. Managers grateful for the men and women who received a decent meal and a second chance at work. The new role came with checks that were more than enough, with medical coverage that let him take Lila to a dentist without the stomach-aching worry he'd carried for years. As the months settled, the Rowan initiative began as an offshoot of Elena's resources and Jack's ideas. Meals for veterans, training programs for hospitality work, a modest housing pilot for those transitioning out of service or out of trouble. It started in a converted storefront with a sign that read in simple letters, "The Rowan Initiative." Volunteers painted it themselves. A once empty lot became a small garden where children handed the chairs to adults and neighbors brought casseroles. Lila learned the rhythm of community dinners. She stacked plates, she handed out napkins, and she made sure the rabbit could watch the activity from a shelf. When the initiative launched, Jack gave a short speech that fit him. A few sentences with no flourish about dignity and work and the small debts people owed one another. He did not want the microphone, but he accepted it because people in the crowd had expected some explanation, some thank you. He spoke of a night in a diner, of a jacket with the initials LR, and he said plainly, "You don't need to be famous to make a difference. You just need to see a thing you can fix and fix it." When Elena's son arrived, Alexander, the name chosen because she had liked its sound of being both strong and gentle, Jack held a place at the back of the room. The hospital photos made their way through small channels. A blurred newborn, a sleeping face, a mother exhausted and lit by the clinic's dim lights. Elena called him one afternoon, voice tired and delighted, and asked if he would stand as godfather. It felt enormous. It felt also unearned in terms of the ledger he'd kept with himself. He had intervened in a restaurant fight. He had taken a job because a woman with influence had offered it freely. But godfather had a different meaning to him, an acceptance that connection had consequences, that the circles we make can hold, feed, and protect each other. He said yes with a voice that held the small quiet of gratitude. Life did not snap into a postcard. There were administrative things to do, meetings to plan, nights where Lila's stomach bug meant he stayed home even when the kitchen needed him. There were times when articles came back to haunt. A name dropped by someone who wanted to be known, a lawyer slinging dirt into the press. But for every shade of smear, there were steady hands. Volunteers who believed in the Rowan initiative because the food was good and because the mission was honest. The program found veterans who needed work and gave them training under Jack's watchful eye. People who had been pushed to the margins found a table. The jacket traveled. It hung on the wall at the initiative storefront, framed under glass with a small plaque. LR, a single act. Children pressed their faces to the window to see the small denim jacket, its letters faded a shade, but proud. People told the story in the way people tell a parable, less precise with dates, truer with feeling. One small act changed a life, they said. Then it changed a neighborhood. On a hot day, months after the night that had started everything, Jack stood at the back of a community center and watched Lila chase after other kids with a rabbit under her arm. Alexander toddled in a carrier near Elena, and someone passed a tray of sandwiches. The sun fell in a soft line over the building's facade and caught on the letters LR framed in the window. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt something like peace settle across his shoulders. He thought about the men who had entered the diner that rain-scrubbed night, how small they had seemed in comparison to the size of the life they tried to intimidate. He thought about the cost he had paid, a job lost, a few rough nights, a temporary exposure. He calculated the gains differently. Lila's laughter, a stable roof, a child's life spared in an unanticipated way. One evening, Elena slipped him a printout of the sonogram that once sat in her coat. "For Alexander," she said, smiling, as if the sonogram had tracked their course like a map. He kept it in a drawer with old menus and a small stack of thank-you notes. He kept it because it reminded him how things could bend, how one small act could pull a thread and eventually stitch a net that caught more than one family. There were no parades, no medals pinned to chests. The men from the law firm had experienced consequences within their professional circles, investigations, suspensions, a partner's resignation. There had been no public criminal theater, no miraculous sentencing. There were papers filed, burdens shifted, and reputations cooled in the kind of slow burn that leaves marks you can learn from. Those who had been intimidated found a voice. That alone was a kind of repair. At a community dinner, Jack poured coffee for a group of veterans and watched the lines around their faces ease as they talked about work, families, the tiny victories of learning to do one thing well again. A young cook asked him once, "How do you not get bitter?" He looked at the kid, at Lila across the room telling a story to a small circle, and he answered plainly, "You don't let the bad things have the only voice. You do the work. You hold fast to the people who matter. You make sure someone else has a seat at the table." Elena stood at his side often, no longer just as benefactor, but as partner, in a small, careful way. They didn't marry. Their relationship never needed a label to be real. They shared impromptu dinners at the community kitchen when schedules allowed, and discussed menus and grant proposals with equal fervor. She sometimes caught him staring at a photo of Lila's embroidery in the frame and would tease him about his soft hands. He'd roll his eyes and find himself smiling. There were small, private moments that stitched the larger story into something warmer. Lila woke the morning of Alexander's christening wearing 2 mismatched socks and announced she had made a speech. At the ceremony, Jack stood beside the parents while Elena braced against the world's prying eyes with a calm that came from choosing where to be vulnerable. When the time came to hand little Alexander to his godfather, the child blinked, surprised by a new pair of hands. Jack felt a tug at his heart he had not been able to name until then. It was the simple pairing of trust and responsibility, of someone believing you were steady enough to hold another life with care. He accepted the role like one would accept a quiet, sacred task. The work of the initiative grew. People who had been helped learned to help. Kitchens opened that trained new cooks. The housing pilot ensured a handful of families had a clean, dependable place to sleep. The small program's success did not erase every towering problem, but it offered a template. Dignity returned through work, not charity alone. On a late autumn afternoon, Jack found himself on a stoop, the LR jacket folded in his lap. Lila came out, cheeks flushed from the brisk air, and threw a rubber ball that skipped into the street. She chased it with a purpose that was all gladness and speed. He could see how much she had grown, how the freckle on her cheek had multiplied into other freckles like stars finding company. He thought of the night he'd made his choice and of how close everything can come to tipping. He thought of Elena's son, Alexander, who had learned to crawl across dusty floors in a living room that had once been small and crowded. A neighbor passed by and stopped to tell him. Her son had found a job at the initiative. She thanked him. That was the currency he had come to value. Neighbors feeling safer, men and women learning a trade, a child with more than just a scraped knee to boast about. The jacket's initials caught the afternoon light and briefly flashed out like a small lighthouse. If someone had told him, in that rain-smeared diner months back, that a limousine would pull up and a woman would hand him a job, and later a community would rise around a small act, he would have laughed in disbelief. Heroes are not made of coincidence. They are made of choice. The choice was simple then. He had stayed. He had set a piece of his life into motion with nothing more than the belief that somebody's fear deserved an answer. That night, Jack pinned the LR jacket back on its peg at the initiative office. Children chased each other through the yard. Alexander slept in a carrier on Elena's chest as she laughed with volunteers. The sound was ordinary and perfect. Jack brushed his hand over the stitched letters and felt the worn embroidery yield to the warmth of his palm. He had been asked once, standing before a room of people, to explain what had driven him to step in that rainy night. He remembered a quiet that held before he answered. "I thought of my daughter," he had said. "I thought about how I would want someone to act if she were alone." It wasn't courage as much as an unwillingness to accept fear as the only thing then. The community kept growing. The Rowan Initiative's name found its way into small grant announcements. People who had received help used what they had learned to train the next group of veterans. Elena kept a careful public face, insisting the work belonged to the community, to the cooks, to the volunteers, only occasionally allowing a camera to focus on a woman with a jacket that said LR. Jack kept his life deliberate and modest. He accepted interviews rarely and turned most away. He wanted the focus to be on the plates of food, the men learning to hold a knife, the faces of the veterans who found their dignity again through labor and connection. Years later, Jack would tell Lila a version of the story, the moments restricted not by embellishment, but by the need to hold it simple for the child who had once embroidered a jacket for love. He would omit the darker, quieter parts of weariness. He would tell her how her crooked letters had once warmed a woman in a rain-soaked diner, and how that simple thing ricocheted into other people's lives. Lila would keep the scrap of denim in a memory box. She would one day show her own children the patch framed in their home. On a bright June morning, with light slanting across the community garden, Jack watched children, some small, some larger, play as volunteers passed trays of food. Someone strummed a guitar softly. Alexander toddled about, no longer an infant but a small person with a grin that mirrored his mother's. Elena stood beside Jack, both of them quieter than they had been when things first started. A toddler dropped his sandwich and frowned, and every adult in the circle made a small, practical joke that put him in motion again. Jack breathed in the garden scents: basil, tomato earth, the tang of citrus someone had used for a dressing. He felt contentment that was not grandiose, but honest, a slow kind. His life had been changed by an act of staying put. He had intervened the night he could have looked away. The consequences had been real and uncomfortable. The returns, stability, connection, community, had been hard-earned and gently given in response. When someone asked him at the end of an evening why he had not kept his jacket once he'd earned better ones, he shrugged. "It reminds me," he said, "that small things can be loud." He looked at the embroidered letters and thought of the many hands that had placed and returned the denim jacket over the years. It had been a token, a talisman, a piece of cloth turned public archive. The circle of kindness had widened beyond him and Elena. It included Murphy's Diner, which was still standing, its neons still smeared by rain when it came. It included the men who had once tried to intimidate, whose careers had been checked and whose behavior had been made visible and accountable in the ways institutions could manage. It included veterans who had learned a trade and a rhythm. It included Lila, who would grow with a story that taught her not only about what it took to stand, but also what it looked like to accept help gracefully and to give it back generously. In the shade of the community garden, Jack folded the small denim jacket in his lap one last time and handed it to Lila to tuck into her backpack. She hugged it like a promise. He watched her walk home, the sun painting a path for her steps. No miracle had descended from the limousine or from Elena's wealth. There had been a choice, a few uncomfortable nights, a public statement that nudged institutions into motion, and a slow, pragmatic rebuilding that kept the dignity of those involved at its center. That was enough. As they closed up the community kitchen that night, Elena patted Jack on the shoulder and said, simply, "Thank you." He answered with a glance at the jacket, at the children playing, at the small pile of bills now held by a foundation that would help others in the same way. The thanks was mutual, the sort of thing that needs no audience. If this story has moved you and you want to hear more like it, consider subscribing. If you'd like to support local veteran programs like the Rowan Initiative, you'll find links below to reputable organizations that focus on meals, job training, and housing assistance. Jack walked home through a soft rain, the neon of the diner in the distance. He thought of that night and of the limo that had brought more than money. It had brought an opening. He thought of the jacket, still warm with the memory of hands and gratitude, and of Lila's small hand that always knew how to find his. The rain washed the city clean in thin lines. Children laughed at a corner down the street. The circle of kindness had come full turn, not as a grand finish, but as a quiet, stubborn fact. Alex toddled by later that evening in a photograph Elena texted him. His small hand wrapped around another's, perhaps Lila's, perhaps someone else. Life moving forward, held steady by people who chose to stay.